All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Hi, my name is Sam Johnson, and I'm the president of the Student Organization for Latin American Studies. And today I'm here to present you Corey Ragsdale, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology, and as he noted, a current recipient of the PhD fellowship from the Latin American and Iberian Institute. Corey received a field research grant from Latin American Iberian Institute and the Tinker Foundation for research that was conducted in Mexico, I believe, in the summer of 2013. Today he's here to share with us his research on the practices of Aztec war and sacrifice. Please join me in welcoming Corey Ragsdale.
Good afternoon, everybody. So the project I'm going to talk to you about a little bit today was, as you mentioned, some research that was funded by here at LAII in Mexico City. But when I went to Mexico, I didn't intend to do this. I actually went to Mexico for some other work and was sort of coerced into this project. Which turned out to be great for me. It's just that the research environment there is so small and so isolated that I didn't know this stuff existed until they said, hey, you do analysis of these things, you should come do it here. Wasn't so much like that. It was more like, if you want us to help you, you need to do this for us. So it was interesting because it turned out to be a very interesting project. So right now I'll be presenting the majority of the stuff that's been found, the results that have been found of this research. There's still an ongoing project. It's one of these really long-going things that'll probably be several years, several different layers of it. So I'm presenting the not yet published results of my analysis so far. And I chose the title to be flashy. As we go through this, you'll kind of understand the irony of why I called it why it says who makes the cut. And actually, when I talk about my colleague who works in Mexico City, this is quite literally what he's investigating. So without further ado, I'll move on. This piece here, I should mention when we get to later, is currently on exhibit in Mexico City at the museum. So just a little bit of a background of what I'm talking about here. This research took place at the Templo Mayor, which is Spanish for the Great Temple. And this is the central temple of the Aztec Empire in the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan. So this would have been right in the middle of the capital Aztec city in central Mexico, which is now the Zocalo, the political district of Mexico City. At the point of contact, the Templo Mayor would have looked something like this. At the point of its initial foundation, it would have been much smaller, but as different emperors took power, every emperor added a layer. So this thing became bigger and bigger and bigger, and by the time contact occurred, it was huge. The Spanish destroyed it and used much of the stones to build the cathedral here, which is right across the street, as well as the presidential palace, which is right across the street on the southern end. So several excavations have been happening here since the 1940s. The stuff that I'm talking about today, this is what it looks like if you went today. So a little bit better than when they started, but not obviously in its glory that it once was. So the way this, as I just mentioned, the way this temple was constructed was in layers. So you can see here, there are different layers, sort of like strata, if you were to dig into the ground and see different layers of soil composition for each emperor's occupation. Keeping in mind that this sort of thing allows fantastic dating. Because with most archaeological artifacts, you have carbon dating where you can get a pretty large range of where it comes from. Here, we know each layer is associated with each emperor, so we can get dating within 20, 30 years. Emperors were typically not in power for very long periods of time, but they were still able to manage to get a layer of this temple. So burials from within this period, relative burials, the ones we're looking at today, are associated with each layer. So when we know the layer and where the layer came from, which emperor was in charge during this time, we know that we can date the remains and artifacts to this period. So some of the things that the burials this includes will be sacrificial victims. We don't know exactly why there were certain sacrificial victims in there, but we know that they were there. And the burials of what are presumed to be elites. So the period that I'm looking at, and again, this is a very long project where we're going to go back in time and look at other areas. But the period that I'm investigating was excavated in 2007, and these remains come from, or all these things come from the period of Ashakayat, which is between 1469 and 1481. So again, really fantastic, better than carbon dating here that we can say we can associate with this stuff. This emperor was pretty well known for his conquests. There were some emperors in Aztec history that sort of slacked off a little bit and didn't make a lot of conquest, and they were not well received, and there's, of course, some questionable things about their deaths. But this particular individual was not one of these. He conquered Tlatelolco, which is the twin city of Tenochtitlan, and also the greatest market in Mesoamerican history. This market saw, during Spanish accounts, over tens and thousands of people per day. So this was a huge accomplishment for Ashakayat. He also expanded the empire into the Huasteca region, which is the northern Gulf Coast of Mexico, and parts of Tepeyac, which are the mountainous region that separates central Mexico and the Gulf Coast of Mexico. He also led several unsuccessful campaigns against the Tarascan Empire in West Mexico and the Tlaxcalans, which were the next door neighbors. And these two powers, the Tarascans and the Tlaxcalans, were still independent of the Aztec Empire at the point of Spanish contact. So most of these campaigns throughout Aztec history were unsuccessful. But here you can see this is a codex. So with the codices, we have very detailed accounts of Aztec history. In this particular case, we're looking at, this would be the name here, the name of Ashakayat, and this is the figure of Ashakayat. And you can see here, every one of these tipped over burning pyramids is the result of a successful conquest. So each of these is a city or town that was conquered by this emperor. Some emperors only have one page. The last ones have 3, 4. But this guy's one of the ones, Ashakayat's one of the ones that gets his full first 2 pages. And it's important to note, Tlatelolco is much larger than all of the other samples, right? So this is a very important accomplishment, and this is something we can tell by looking in the codices. And it's something to keep in mind as I go through the talk. So from all this information that we have, I developed some research questions. The first of these is who are the ofrendas that were used as sacrifice, and who were used to create the skull masks? So we know there are sacrificial victims, and we know that there are masks, which I'll discuss, made of human skulls. Who are these people? Where did they come from? And did they come from the same region or the same cultural group? So are we looking at a wide array of individuals in geographic regions, or are we looking from the same similar group? And then, as I mentioned, with quite literally who makes the cut, we are also interested in where the masks were made, or were they acquired from local workshops? Were they made right there in Tenochtitlan at the Templo Mayor, or were they made elsewhere? So I developed, based on the differences between archaeological interpretation and ethno-historic interpretation, we have 2 hypotheses. One is that these individuals that are used for skull masks are defeated war chiefs. They're going to be related to war campaigns that occurred throughout the period of Ashakayat, or captives that were taken through war. So we're looking at, archaeologically, things that are supported by warfare. Alternatively, they could be individuals of local religious significance. So these individuals could be priests, things like this. And this is supported by ethnographic accounts of masks being used in religious ceremony. So these are 2 opposing hypotheses. So to dive into this, one of the things that the Aztecs are very popular for are war captives. There's numerous uncountable, I should say, stories of war captives, and lots of these are presented in the codices. And this was sort of a great way to attain status in Aztec Mexico. If you could take prisoners, and the more important prisoners you could take, the better it was going to be for you and your status. And we also know that through pictographs and in the codices that captives were used in human sacrifice. So we know that this was sort of, in some cases, the focal point of warfare. The warfare was not always, in Aztec times, was not always to gain territory and property. It was sometimes there were just wars just for sacrificial victims. So among some of the remains I studied, not only from the Templo Mayor, but from other sites around Mexico City, there's a lot of evidence of trauma. Here we have, on this poor individual here, 3 different traumatic marks from blows to the head, 2 of which were healed, which means they had no influence on this individual's death, and actually healed at different stages. So we knew that this blow was preceded several months by this blow, which was preceded several months by this blow. So this individual was a highly active person in warfare. We also see some blows to the face. So there's a fracture on where the jaw meets the skull, the temporomandibular joint. And this individual has cranial trauma, but is also burned from lying face down on one side in a fire. So we're assuming that with head trauma and the char on the side of the skull, that this individual met his end violently. So these are a few examples of what we see all over the samples in Mexico. Warfare was a very important part of civilization at the time. We also see these sorts of things in religious ceremony. So there are a lot of deities that are associated with death, sacrifice, decapitation. Things like this we see consistently throughout the historic accounts. Masks were used very often in religious ceremony, and you can see here with these deities, the god and goddess of death here, you'll see that there's a skull mask with a blade coming out the tip of it. And so this is not unlike the things that we find that are made of human remains. So an argument can be made that these things are related to religious ceremony as well. So to test these hypotheses, I collected some data from a sample of 47 human crania, right? 34 were regular sacrificial victims, 9 were skull masks, and 4 were Tzompantli skulls, which are skulls set on a skull rack. But this part won't be incorporated in the research now because we still have to collect several more for this to be able to be analyzed. But 9 of these individuals were represented as skull masks, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then the other 34, the majority of these were just regular sacrificial victims. I also, in the analysis with comparing genetic similarities, I also collected data from all of these samples, which are known military cities known with military interaction with Mexico, Tenochtitlan. So Tlatelolco, which is the most notable conquest, a few other in central Mexico, one Aztec, one Tlaxcalan, and one from the Tarascan Empire. Tzintzuntzan, which is the Tarascan capital, as well as a couple others. Of course, when you talk about the Aztecs, you can't do it without talking about ritual human sacrifice. It's important to note that there was sacrifice occurring all over Mexico during this time. However, the Aztecs were unique in this way. They needed large amounts of individuals to meet the requirements of sacrifice. It wasn't okay to just have a ruler give some blood and things like this to appease the gods. They needed very large numbers of individuals to be able to satisfy their needs as a sacrifice. And this was a huge part of their religious ideology. In fact, the Aztec origin myth of how they came to be on the earth is based on sacrifice. So the sacrifice that occurred of the moon goddess is what gave life to humans on the planet. So we were born in sacrifice. We continue through sacrifice throughout this civilization. They could have been slaves, defeated warriors, ball game players, etc., etc. However, you were able to get individuals for sacrifice. That was the way to go. So for an offering skull, this is now we're talking about regular sacrificial victims. You can see that they're pretty well preserved. This one here has some missing here, but you can see that the skulls are actually pretty well pretty well preserved, especially the dentition, which is what I'm using to sort of get at the analyses I'm presenting here. Most of these are just skulls, so we don't have postcranial body. Particularly with the masks, you just have a skull. There's no rest of the body. Some of these individuals had some other long bones and things like this, but the skull masks themselves were just skulls, which is why my colleague was interested in seeing if they were made locally or elsewhere. So we had to sort of limit our analysis to what we could do with the skulls. The skull masks are a little bit different. So these are now not going to be regular sacrifice victims. And these are found with another individual who is fairly complete. And the way this works is you have a skeleton who we're presuming is an elite or somebody of very high importance. And this individual is buried. And then he'll have lots of goods around the individual, and then a skull mask, and then usually a couple other stone masks of jade, obsidian, something like this. But this mask, when we talk about skull mask, we're talking about a mask that was made from a human skull for another individual. And these things were made with non-lethal shells, non-human bones associated in there, as well as stone blades. So here you can see, this is in situ, this is in the ground version view of what we're looking at. So here is our wearer. This is our individual who is buried here. And this would be this individual's mask. And this is a sawfish, the blade of a sawfish, which you don't have to be a geographic expert to realize that there's not a lot of sawfish in central Mexico, right? So this person was definitely important enough to have something imported from the coast. We also see with the mask shells, also not in high abundance in central Mexico. And these shells are actually from the Gulf Coast in Veracruz. And pyrite we will use for the eyes when we get through a little bit here. And chert blades, knives that were put into the mouth and the nose of the skulls. So this is one of the skull masks. This is what you get when you look at a skull mask. So notice it's cut at the back here, right? We have the face. It's dyed green, which means there was copper on there, probably a copper mask, which typically dyes the bone green. Some red paint here, which we think is probably cinnabar, another thing that was mined in southern Mexico, not in the highlands. Shells from the Gulf Coast, and eyes that were made of highly finely polished pyrite. So this is what we call fool's gold, right? If you turned this thing in the light, it would have a nice yellowish hue. Fool's gold. And then also you can see the opening in the mouth from where there was a blade in the mouth and then a blade in the nose aperture here. And it's also interesting about this individual, there's dental modification of the incisors, which means these incisors were intentionally modified to look scary, essentially, is what these individuals did. And in some parts of Mexico, this is really limited to elites and warriors. Drill holes in the top, presumably for feathers and things like this. But this is basically a great example of what a skull mask looks like. Another good one without dental modification here. So again, same sort of pattern. Drill holes, false stones and shells for the eyes, things like this. Some are not as well preserved. So those two ones are, the ones on exhibit. Those are sort of the, if you want to show a picture of a skull mask, show this one, right? This one's not so much. This one did not survive the elements as well. But again, you could see this yellow from the pyrite, shells behind it, lots of taphonomic change, things like this. But all the same things, drill holes, etc. So whenever you're looking at human remains and you're interested in archaeological questions, you're interested in investigating demographics, one of the important things is to get a sex distribution. So this is an estimation of sex based on characteristics on the skull. Right? If we have pelvis, that makes it even better. But in this particular case, we just have crania, which gives us about a 90% reliability. So you can say this, if you see feminine or masculine features on one of these skulls, you could say with a pretty high certainty that it's either male or female. Not perfect. It's more like 99 when you get a pelvis. But still pretty good. And you'll see here, interestingly, male, female, unable to determine. So with the regular skulls, we've got 13 males, but we have 7 females in this population. So a pretty high percentage of females, which was, to be honest, completely unexpected for me. I kind of went into this assuming that these were all war-related captives and did not expect to find a bunch of female skulls. There were also children, a few children, but I was unable to do the analysis on them in the same way because obviously there wouldn't be a sex distribution because this is before adolescence. You can't really determine sex with the skull. And also the genetic information was not as good. With the skull masks, however, they're all male, no females present. And these were in such, they were good and well enough preserved where we could do all of them, right? Some of the regular skulls were so bashed up that we were unable to sort of get a reliable sex distribution. But again, this is an interesting pattern, the difference between the two. Another important demographic piece of information is age. So for age, we used dental eruption. And so here you can see this lower M3, which is your wisdom teeth, right? These are the last things to grow, and there's a process, and in a lot of cases we could really see root development, so you can get a pretty good estimation of when this thing is coming in. And it comes in between 15 and 25 years into adulthood, which is why they're called wisdom teeth. And this individual, the level of growth suggests about 19 or 20 for this particular individual, years old. So dentition is a pretty reliable way of aging. We also have a marker on the inside of the skull here, where your sphenoid bone, which you cannot touch, it's inside, and your your facial bones, which you can touch. There's an element here called the spheno-occipital synchondrosis. And basically this is a really long word for saying this is where two bones meet, the sphenoid and the occipital. And this thing is one of the last things to fuse in your skull. So this occurs between 20 and 26. So we can look at this and say, based on fusion development, this person is either under 20 years old or over 25. Which becomes important because when we look at regular skulls, we've got several young adults, a good amount of middle adults, and no older adults for either. Older adult's going to be somebody over the age of 50 or 45. A young adult is going to be under the age of 25, and a middle adult is going to be over the age of 25. So again, these things are sort of we can see if these people are teenagers in their early 20s or if they're older in their 30s. With the skull masks, we have a couple of young adults, but the majority of these individuals are middle adults. And it turns out the middle adults are on the other end of the scale. They're in their early 30s. So the majority of the ones that were individuals used as skull masks died at between 30 and 35. This is my colleague Emiliano in our workspace, and what he's doing is he's taking polymer samples, of defleshing marks, knife marks from removing the skin, drill marks, and cut marks. And what he does is he does a really non-invasive way. He puts a polymer on there, and then he puts what looks like to me, as a not hardcore archaeologist, a piece of Scotch tape, and lots of these, and takes an impression of this cut, and then he's going to, which is my interpretation. I've only said that to him once, and I'll never say it again. But he's getting a non-invasive impression of the actual cut mark that is being made. And what he does with this is he takes it to a lab where he can do scanning electron microscopy, SEM, right? And he can compare experimental cut marks. So he and a few other individuals replicate tools, chert blades, obsidian blades, things like this, replicate them and then make cuts on bone, and then use that as a proxy for what kind of cut is made by what kind of tool and what kind of stone. And then he compares these with what we found on the skull masks and the ofrendas. So he's comparing cut marks with tools that are reproduced through experimentation. And this is all done through scanning electronic microscopy. So again, who makes the cut is the question that he's interested in. For my part, there was no Scotch tape. I am taking observations, or take observations on the surfaces of teeth. So I sent a paper outlaying my methodology to my colleague. He's been a colleague of mine for over 6 years now, Emiliano, to try to get access to a collection at the university there. And when somebody at the university read this paper, they said, we really need you to do this on the skull masks. And the reason this is great is because you can make hundreds of observations on one person's dentition, and you can use this as a proxy for genetic relationships. Here's why. Most of what is on your body skeletally can be affected by the environment. So if you work out a lot, you might have big musculature. If you have dietary deficiencies, you might have thinner cortical bones, stuff like this. Your teeth are completely developed before they're exposed to the world. So your tooth grows and then it comes out of the gum, which means everything that is involved in the structure of these things here, your teeth, are genetic related. So hundreds of these traits that you can look at are directly related to genes. So you can do hundreds of these, and what's even better, especially when you're working with something that's on exhibit, a key item on exhibit, is it's completely non-destructive. So sure, you could drill a tooth and get an isotope reading from it, but you destroy the tooth and you essentially destroy the piece. Here you can do observations, put it right back on exhibit, which they actually pulled one off exhibit while I was there in the middle of the afternoon, and then put it right back. But you can do this, and nobody's the wiser. So you can get lots of information without having to destroy something. There are other things you can understand from teeth. So I also took the advantage to look at disease and dental wear. Again, here's a third molar erupting, so we know this person is in their teenage years. Here, I think this individual was about 17 years old-ish, based on root development. And so wear patterns, you can see here there's a lot of wear. The tooth's barely been worn down. Here, there's not as much. Wear patterns are a good indicator of diet. So in the Southwest, for example, most people were eating grit, corn that was made with stone tools, stone grit. And when you're ingesting, you're chewing, imagine chewing a piece of cornbread that has sand in it, right? And if this is your primary diet, then you're going to have a lot of wear on your teeth. If you ever try eating sand, you know exactly why. I don't know why you would, but you know exactly how this happens, right? It happens to me all the time because you're at the beach, you drop a sandwich, it's still a sandwich, right? But typically, people of lower economic status will have only one item available to them in their diet. So you'll expect to see this on working people. But people of higher status can have anything they want. So we know, for example, Moctezuma, the last emperor of Mexico, had fish brought to him from the coasts probably daily. And he could do that, right? But if you're a guy who's a basket weaver in central Mexico and you ask someone to bring you fish, and remember this is before vehicles and no beasts of burden or anything, you're probably not going to get the result you wish, right? So we can make a lot of assumptions based on just dental wear. And as it turns out, there is a lot of severe wear, lots of wear on the regular skulls, the regular sacrifice victims, lots of dental wear, which means they were eating grit food and not a huge diverse diet. But the skull masks, there's very little wear, which means the people with that represent the skull mask had a very diverse diet. They could have fruit, they could have fish, they could have all kinds of things that don't wear your teeth down. There is also a lot of information you can get of nutritional deficiency and disease on teeth. So here you'll notice some horizontal lines going across the teeth. These lines are called enamel hypoplasias. And what happens is your teeth are forming in layers as you're growing, right? When you're a child, so this individual was between the age of 3 and 5 when he got sick, really, really sick. When you're a child, if you get sick or you're just not having adequate nutrition, there will be an interruption in the way these teeth are formed. So you can imagine if you have a printer, you're printing out a document, and then you run out of ink, and what happens is it starts chattering, and putting splotches, this is sort of the same process that grows with teeth, right? It's nice and clean, you have good nutrition, and then there's a stutter, and then it continues. And we can use this to determine who had some problems when they were growing up as far as diet. We also can see some evidence on the inside of the orbits, porosity here. This is cribble orbitalia. This is from an iron deficiency. So if you're not having iron in your diet, you're going to get some of this. And then finally, tooth loss, which we have here. Tooth loss is associated with heavy wear, and again, not a very good diet. So you wear down your teeth, you're exposing the inside to sugars, which you find in corn, and then you lose this tooth. And again, these things are all present on regular skulls and none of this in the skull masks. So with all this information, I also did what's called a discriminant function analysis. So this is very useful nowadays in forensic applications. There's a forensic application to this. You can take an equation of traits for an individual, place it with an equation, place it with a bunch of compared individuals, and see how similar that person is to everybody else you're comparing them with. So this doesn't give you an exact affiliation of the person, but it says, hey, this person has a suite of traits that looks just like this group, right? And so here, with the T's, all the green dots are going to be the Gulf Coast, the Huasteca region. The blue dots are going to be the Tlaxcalan area. Purple are the Tarascans. And red are central Mexico, Tlatelolco, Azcapotzalco. You'll notice this is for the regular skulls. We have several individuals that are not fitting anything here. They're sort of outside the range of variation that we're looking at, which simply means I have no comparative data for where these individuals are probably from, right? You also notice there are some individuals that fit within the distribution of the Huasteca, central Mexico, one person over here from West Mexico, but you'll notice that they're sort of distributed everywhere, right? You don't have a cluster of stars that are really focused together. This means these sacrificial victims were coming from all over the place. None are directly associated with a particular site. With the skull masks, we now see a much different pattern, a much easier pattern to follow. So this individual, you may notice the distribution is different. And remember, every time you run this test, it's going to tell the similarity between any two individuals in your study. So now we have more data for these guys because there's better preservation. So now with more data, we can see there's a nice tight little group of Huasteca populations here. You would expect these to be different than the purple, right? Because they're on opposite coasts of Mexico. Everybody is a little bit similar because of the very limited sort of in thousands of years migration history of Mexico, but there's still some differences. And this individual here is more similar to the Huasteca. These individuals are more similar to the Tarascans, and these individuals are very central Mexico oriented. And in fact, if you look at the statistical output, they're very, very similar to the people from Tlatelolco. Very similar. Also, the ones that have the most elaborate treatment are mostly similar to Tlatelolco, and one individual from the what looks like the Tarascan area, right? So the ones that were receiving the most elaborate treatment of the skull masks are local as far as Tlatelolco, central Mexico, the important campaign, and the Tarascans, which was sort of the one that got away for the Aztecs, right? They were constantly trying to to defeat the Tarascans and constantly losing. So this would have been a very important thing to have. So with all this information, we can make some assertions. There's some indications of information here. One of them is sex distribution is only variable among the sacrificial victims, right? As far as with the sample size we have, there are no females among the skull masks. And this is, of course, why we need to go through other time periods and see if this is consistent. But we do know that females were a part of sacrifice, which is something to be noted. Most of the skull masks remember the ones that are elaborately treated, were middle adults, right? So these are older individuals. They're not young individuals. Diet was much more diverse for the individuals that represent the skull masks. The regular individuals came from various classes. We can tell by nutritional deficiency and dental wear that they were not of elite status. And also the skull masks mostly fit within the variation of the groups compared. You'll notice that in the regular ofrendas here, go back a couple slides, you've got some individuals that just don't match. And even the ones that do are along the outsides, right? With the skull masks, they're all incorporated within the sample, right? So everybody that we compared, as far as from war campaigns, the skull masks fit within this group. So the results indicate, and some further testing, of course, is always necessary, but the results indicate that the skull masks are probably more important individuals. And this is based on their diet, the treatment of the skulls themselves, and that these were all similar to the individuals that were in contact through war. We know through the codex. So these could be war chiefs. They could be important individuals from areas within political or military conquest. And typically, this also fits with the aging distribution. So typically you don't gain your status at the age of 20, just like in our society. You normally don't gain your status, especially in the academic world, at the age of 20, right? It's those guys that are in their 30s and 40s where you really start to read their stuff, right? And so this is where, that's not true, but it can be. This is where this happens, right? You have some older individuals, great diets, very well treated, all fitting within this rich distribution. On the other hand, the regular victims, not so much, right? Poor diet, poor nutrition, not fitting within the areas, not all fitting within areas related to war. So here we might be seeing some evidence of tributary sacrifice. So people giving sacrificial victims as a price, as a cost for tribute. And so in this test, we tested war populations. We could also try in the future and test tributary populations and see where they match. But this is sort of a way of saying that not everyone that was used in ritual sacrifice was related to war, and they certainly weren't all male. And they certainly weren't all high status, right? There was some variation occurring here. If you wanted to be a mask, though, you needed to be a pretty high status male from these war regions, at least based on preliminary results. And so I would like to acknowledge first the LAII for their generous funding for this. And also thanks to my colleagues in Mexico City. At the INA in Mexico City, the big museum is where I got all my comparative samples. And this place is amazing. It's like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. You just get into a room, and then you can just see boxes forever. And those are all skeletal remains. My colleague Miliano Melgar to Templo Mayor, and of course the individuals at the university who gave me the Huasteca data. And I had some help from Frances Berdan. She's a translator, one of the translators of the Codex Mendoza, and an expert in ethnographic materials. She helped me to make sure I was interpreting these things correctly. And Heather Edgar, my advisor. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. And that's it.